The sun dipped behind the rolling fields, casting long golden streaks over the land. The kind of view that made a man feel at peace. Ethan Hayes stood on his porch, a worn coffee mug in hand, breathing in the scent of fresh earth and livestock. This farm had been in his family for generations, a legacy built by his grandfather's hands and preserved through years of sweat and sacrifice. It wasn't just land, it was history, pride, and a testament to resilience. But that peace was about to be shattered, not by a storm, not by drought, but by something far worse. A force of sheer entitlement was marching up his driveway, her pristine beige heels clicking against the gravel, her manicured fingers clutched around a clipboard like it was a weapon. Margaret Dawson, the self-appointed queen of the Crestwood Estates HOA, a woman who had never planted a seed, shoveled dirt, or done an honest day's work outside of dictating others' lives, was coming for him. And this time, he had a feeling she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. Love seeing entitled people get what they deserve. Subscribe for more crazy stories like this. Ethan watched her approach with the weary patience of a man who had dealt with unruly cattle before, except this particular pest wasn't one he could herd away. Margaret's expression was tight, the kind of forced smile that barely hid the condescension bubbling beneath. She paused at the bottom of the porch steps, nose wrinkling as if the mere presence of soil offended her. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice crisp with the authority she believed she possessed. "I'm here to discuss some concerns regarding your property." Ethan took a slow sip of coffee, not bothering to offer her a seat, and leaned against the railing. "Funny," he mused, "I don't recall signing up for any HOA meetings." Her lips twitched, a flicker of annoyance flashing across her perfectly sculpted face. "While that may be true," she said, regaining her poise, "your farm borders Crestwood Estates, and as such your, let's say, aesthetic choices have become problematic." Ethan arched a brow. "Problematic? You mean my barn?" Margaret nodded, as if she had just received confirmation of a grave offense. "The large, unsightly red structure is an eyesore to our residents. Neutral tones would blend better with the neighborhood. And then there's the matter of the noise. Your rooster, for instance, is a nuisance. Several residents have complained about being woken before sunrise." Ethan let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "So let me get this straight. You want me to repaint a 100-year-old barn and tell my rooster to hit the snooze button because your suburbanites don't like the sound of the countryside?" Margaret didn't flinch. "I understand change can be difficult, but this is about maintaining property values. It's in everyone's best interest, including yours. If you were to consider selling one day, it would be advantageous for your land to be more in line with community standards." Ethan set his coffee down, finally pushing off the railing, his voice firm. "I'm not selling, and I don't answer to the HOA. So as far as I see it, there's no issue here." Margaret's smile tightened, but her eyes darkened. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice dropping to a more deliberate tone, "I was hoping to handle this amicably, but if you refuse to cooperate, I may have to involve county authorities. There are zoning ordinances to consider, and I would hate for this to become a legal matter." Ethan let the silence hang between them for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. He had dealt with bad storms, equipment failures, and the back-breaking work that came with keeping this land thriving. But this was something different, a battle of wills, a fight against a woman who had never been told no in her life and wasn't about to accept it now. He finally let out a sigh, stepping down the porch steps until he was standing just a foot away from her, close enough that she had to slightly crane her neck to keep up her defiant stance. "Margaret," he said evenly, "you and your HOA don't own me my land or anything on it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got real work to do." Margaret's expression flickered, just for a second, before she quickly masked it with another professional smile. "We'll see about that," she said, turning on her heel and striding back toward her luxury SUV, her clipboard still clutched in her manicured hands. Ethan watched as she drove off, the tires spitting gravel in frustration. He had seen her type before, the kind of person who mistook money and power for authority, who believed rules were just another tool for control. But she had no idea what kind of fight she was picking. Ethan had never been one to back down, especially when it came to protecting what was his. As the dust settled from her departure, he finished the last sip of his coffee, knowing full well that this wasn't the last he'd see of Margaret Dawson. No! This was only the beginning. Ethan had expected Margaret Dawson to be persistent, but he had underestimated just how relentless she could be. It started with letters, official-looking documents with the HOA's logo stamped across the top, filled with legalese that tried to sound intimidating. The first one demanded he repaint his barn to match Crestwood Estate's neutral aesthetic. The second insisted that his animals were violating some imaginary noise ordinance. The third, more aggressive than the rest, threatened to escalate the matter to the county if he didn't take immediate corrective action. Ethan didn't bother responding. He knew the law. His farm was zoned for agriculture, and nothing in the HOA's rulebook had any authority over his land. He tossed the letters onto his kitchen counter like junk mail and went on with his life. But Margaret wasn't the type to accept silence as an answer. The complaints to the county started rolling in next. First, it was about his livestock. Claims that his animals were being kept in unsanitary conditions and that the farm was a potential health hazard. Then it was his fencing, with accusations that it was encroaching on Crestwood property. He even got a visit from an environmental inspector after someone reported that his farming practices were disrupting the local ecosystem. Each time an official showed up, clipboard in hand and suspicion in their eyes, Ethan met them with the same calm patience. He walked them through the property, let them inspect every inch of his land, and watched their expressions turn from skepticism to mild embarrassment when they realized everything was in perfect compliance. By the third visit, the county officials started catching on. One of them, an older man named Roger who had clearly seen his fair share of frivolous complaints, finally sighed and shook his head as he looked over Ethan's well-maintained farm. "Son, I don't know who you pissed off, but they've got us running in circles out here," he said, rubbing his forehead. Ethan chuckled. Wouldn't happen to be a certain HOA president, would it? Roger gave him a knowing look but didn't answer directly. "Let's just say some people have too much time on their hands," he muttered before closing his folder. "You won't hear from us again unless there's a real issue. Sorry for the hassle." Ethan thanked him, but he knew Margaret wasn't finished. This wasn't just about complaints. This was about power. And she wasn't going to stop until she thought she had won. The next escalation came in the form of something Ethan never expected. One afternoon, while fixing a section of his old wooden fence, he heard the distinct, grating roar of a chainsaw. His first thought was that a neighbor was cutting down a tree, but as he walked toward the noise, suspicion crept in. It was coming from the property line, the one separating his farm from Crestwood Estates. As he approached, he spotted a group of workers in bright orange vests, already halfway through setting up a steel fence, right on his land. Ethan's jaw clenched as he took in the sight of them digging into his property, the fresh wooden posts standing like an ugly scar against the land he had cared for all his life. And there, overseeing the whole thing, was Margaret, clipboard in hand, watching the construction like a queen surveying her empire. Ethan strode up, his voice carrying over the rattling hum of machinery. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The workers paused, glancing between him and Margaret, clearly uneasy. Margaret, on the other hand, turned with a serene smile, the kind that masked absolute smugness. "Oh, Mr. Hayes, I was just about to inform you," she said, her tone dripping with fake politeness. "The HOA has decided to install a privacy fence for the benefit of our residents. Your property, while historically significant, does not align with our community's aesthetic. This fence will help maintain the visual harmony of Crestwood Estates." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "This fence is on my land," he said, his voice low and firm. Margaret barely blinked. "That's debatable," she replied smoothly. "You see, the community recently reviewed older survey maps, and we believe the property lines were drawn incorrectly. Since your farm borders our neighborhood, it's in everyone's best interest to adjust accordingly." Ethan took a slow step forward, turning his attention to the workers. "You boys got a permit for this." One of the men hesitated before muttering. HOA told us they had all the legal permissions." Ethan smirked. "They don't. And if you don't pack up and leave in the next 5 minutes, you're trespassing. Which means I'll be calling the sheriff." That did it. The workers exchanged nervous glances before one of them shut off the chainsaw. They started gathering their equipment, clearly not willing to go to jail for an overzealous HOA president. Margaret, however, was livid. "You can't just order them to leave," she snapped. "This is a community decision." Ethan pulled out his phone, holding it up as he started dialing. "Then let's make it official and have the county sort it out." Margaret's face paled. "There's no need for that," she said stiffly. "Then you'd best tell your people to pack it up," Ethan said, voice dripping with amusement. With a murderous glare, Margaret signaled for the workers to leave. The fence project was dead before it had even begun, but Ethan knew better than to think this was the end. Margaret wasn't the type to take defeat lightly, and if she couldn't force him to comply through complaints, intimidation, or even outright trespassing, she was going to find another way to make his life miserable. Ethan watched her drive off, already knowing she was planning her next move. He had dealt with stubborn animals before, but nothing quite like Margaret Dawson. And something told him she wasn't going to stop until she had tried everything in her power to break him. But she had underestimated one thing. Ethan had spent his whole life working against forces trying to bring him down, and he wasn't about to start losing now. Ethan had known Margaret Dawson wouldn't back down, but even he was surprised at how low she was willing to go. Just a few days after the failed fence debacle, he woke up to the sight of flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the side of his barn. His stomach dropped as he set down his coffee and stepped onto the porch, where 2 county sheriff's deputies were waiting near their patrol car, their hands resting casually on their belts. The moment they spotted him, one of them, a stocky officer with graying hair, gave a tired nod. "Mr. Hayes," he greeted. "Morning, Sheriff," Ethan responded, already knowing exactly who had sent them. He barely had to ask. "Let me guess. Margaret Dawson?" The other officer, a younger guy who looked like he was still getting used to wearing the uniform, glanced at his partner before clearing his throat. "We received a report of a public disturbance," he said, looking over his notepad. "Caller claimed there was excessive noise coming from your property, potential violations of animal welfare laws, and a possible zoning infraction related to unauthorized commercial activity." Ethan let out a breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "Let me guess. The caller sounded real upset, claimed to be concerned for the safety of the community." The older officer sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Let's just say we've been out here before for similar complaints. Seems like someone's got a real issue with your farm." Ethan crossed his arms, nodding toward his perfectly peaceful property. "Well, as you can see, there's no disturbance, no abuse, no illegal activity, unless planting vegetables is suddenly a felony." The younger officer looked genuinely uncomfortable now, glancing at the barn, the open pastures, and the few cows lazily grazing in the distance. He shifted his weight, looking back at his partner as if silently asking why they had even bothered coming out here. The older deputy gave Ethan a knowing look. "Mind if we take a quick walk around, just to say we did our job?" Ethan sighed but stepped aside, motioning for them to do what they needed to do. He had nothing to hide. He watched as they walked the property, checked on his animals, and inspected the farm's general condition. It didn't take long. After a few minutes they returned, and the older officer gave him a tight-lipped smile. "Everything looks good," he said. "We'll file this under unfounded complaint and be on our way." Ethan shook his head, watching as they turned back toward their car. But just before they left, the younger officer hesitated, then looked at him with curiosity. "Why she got it out for you?" he asked. "Most HOA folks stick to their own neighborhoods." Ethan smirked. "Because I told her no." The younger cop blinked before chuckling under his breath. "Yeah, that'll do it." With that, They got back into their cruiser and pulled away, leaving Ethan standing on his porch, watching the dust settle in their wake. But even as a patrol car disappeared down the road, he knew this wasn't over. Margaret had tried complaints, she had tried legal intimidation, and now she had tried weaponizing the police against him. She was escalating, and he had no doubt that whatever she was planning next would be even worse. He didn't have to wait long to find out. The very next morning, as he drove into town for supplies, his phone buzzed with a text from a neighbor. It was a picture of a giant for sale sign planted right at the edge of his property. Ethan nearly swerved off the road when he saw it. The sign was official looking, with big bold letters that read, "Under negotiation, future expansion of Crestwood Estates, coming soon." Beneath it, in smaller text, was the name of a real estate agency. Ethan gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He turned the truck around so fast the tires kicked up gravel. By the time he pulled up to the sign, his heart was pounding with fury. This wasn't just an insult. This was an outright lie. Margaret had crossed into outright fraud, pretending his land was already being absorbed into her perfect little neighborhood. He barely had time to process it before another car pulled up beside him. And, of course, there she was. Margaret stepped out of her luxury SUV, a smug smile playing on her lips as she adjusted the sleeve of her tailored blazer. "Oh, Mr. Hayes," she chirped, feigning surprise. "I see you've noticed the sign." Ethan ripped it straight out of the ground before turning to face her. "Take a wild guess how I feel about it," he said, voice low and dangerous. Margaret barely blinked. Now, let's not be hasty," she said, clasping her hands together. "There seems to have been a little misunderstanding. You see, we at the HOA have been in discussions about acquiring nearby properties for future expansion. Some realtors got a bit overexcited, and this sign was placed prematurely." Ethan let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You expect me to believe that?" Margaret tilted her head. "Regardless of how you feel about it, Mr. Hayes, this is inevitable. Our community is growing, and your farm is sitting on what could be valuable residential land. It would be in your best interest to consider selling." Ethan stepped forward until he was inches from her, his voice dangerously calm. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call whoever put this sign up and tell them to never set foot on my property again. Because if I see another one, I won't be tearing it down. I'll be suing the entire HOA for fraud." For the first time, Margaret's confident smile faltered. "Now, Mr. Hayes, let's not be rash." Ethan pulled out his phone, lifting it for her to see. "And if you don't call them right now, I'll make sure the county gets involved. I'm sure they'd love to hear about an HOA illegally claiming land that isn't theirs." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a brief second, he saw something flicker in her expression, real fear. She huffed, then reached for her own phone. "Fine," she snapped. "If it means so much to you, I'll have it removed." Ethan stepped back, arms crossed, waiting as she made the call. He didn't take his eyes off her the entire time. When she finally hung up, she let out a stiff sigh. "There. Happy." Ethan smirked. "Not yet. But I will be." Margaret didn't ask what he meant. She turned and stalked back to her car, slamming the door with enough force to make the vehicle shake. As she drove off, Ethan watched her go, feeling something shift in the air. She was running out of moves, and he was just getting started. Ethan knew Margaret wasn't done. People like her never accepted defeat. They just regrouped and found another way to strike. And sure enough, her final move came just a week later, a desperate, last-ditch effort to claim victory over something she had no right to control. He woke up that morning to the sight of brand-new, freshly printed "No Trespassing." Private community property signs lining the entire stretch of road leading to his farm. She had actually tried to claim a public county-maintained road as part of Crestwood Estates, cutting off his access under the guise of community safety. Ethan stared at the ridiculous display, hardly able to believe the audacity. The woman had tried complaints, inspectors, fences, police, and even fraudulent real estate claims, and now she was just flat out trying to block him from his own property. He didn't even waste time being angry. He simply pulled out his phone, snapped a few pictures, and made a call to the county office. When the officials arrived later that afternoon, they weren't just annoyed, they were furious. The moment the county road supervisor stepped out of his truck and took one look at the signs, he let out a sharp laugh and muttered something about entitled lunatics. Ethan crossed his arms and watched as the man yanked one of the signs out of the ground, shaking his head. "She's really outdone herself this time," the supervisor grumbled, tossing the sign onto the back of his truck. "This road is public property. She has no right to restrict access, and if she thinks she can just claim it for her HOA, she's about to have a real bad day." Ethan smirked. "You going to handle it?" The supervisor let out a short laugh. "Oh, we'll handle it, all right. And if she doesn't remove every single one of these signs by tomorrow morning, the county's going to start issuing fines. Big ones." It didn't take long for the news to travel back to Margaret, and by that evening, she was once again storming up Ethan's driveway, her phone clutched in her perfectly manicured hand, her expression a mask of barely contained fury. "You had no right," she started, but Ethan cut her off before she could even get going. "No, Margaret, you had no right. That's a public road. You don't own it. The HOA doesn't own it. You're lucky they're giving you the chance to take those signs down yourself before they start charging you." Margaret's face turned a shade of red that almost matched the barn she had complained about so much. "You think you're so clever," she seethed, "but you can't fight progress forever. This farm is a relic of the past. Sooner or later, Crestwood Estates is going to expand, and you're going to have to move on." Ethan took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "Margaret, let me make one thing crystal clear to you. This farm has been here long before you, before Crestwood Estates, before your ridiculous HOA rules. It's not going anywhere. You are." Margaret's jaw tightened, her hands trembling as she struggled to maintain control of the situation. But for the first time, she had no response. She turned sharply on her heel and stormed away, her expensive heels crunching against the gravel. Ethan watched her go, feeling the shift in power, the undeniable truth settling in. She had lost. Completely. The next morning, every single one of the signs was gone, and by the end of the week, the real shock came. An emergency HOA meeting had been called, and for the first time, the very board members who had once backed Margaret without question were starting to turn against her. Word had spread about her antics, her legal overreach, the endless complaints, and the fraud she had tried to pull with the fake real estate deal. The residents of Crestwood Estates, once afraid to challenge her, were now openly questioning her leadership. That night, as Ethan sat on his porch with a cold beer in hand, his phone buzzed with a message from Linda, one of the more reasonable HOA members who had always hated Margaret's nonsense, but never had the power to stop it. "It's happening. They're voting to remove her." Ethan smirked, taking a sip of his beer before texting back a single word. "Good." An hour later, another message came through. "She's out." Just like that, the reign of HOA Karen had officially ended. The next morning, Ethan took a slow, satisfied walk down to his property line, where, for the first time in months, he found peace. No threats. No ridiculous signs. No HOA minions trying to enforce rules that didn't apply to him. And then the final victory arrived, a for sale sign in Margaret Dawson's front yard. The woman who had spent months trying to make his life miserable, who had thought she could bend him to her will, was leaving Crestwood Estates for good. The rumor mill was already buzzing. She had been quietly pressured to leave by the very community she had once ruled over, her iron grip shattered by her own greed and overreach. Ethan didn't celebrate with speeches or fanfare. He didn't need to. Instead, he did something far more fitting. He called up a local sign maker and had a brand new sign installed right at the edge of his property, right where Crestwood Estates could see it every single day. Big, bold, and impossible to ignore, it read, "Welcome to Hayes Farm. No HOA, no Karens, no problems." It became a local landmark, People from all over town started stopping by just to take pictures with it. And as for Ethan, he went right back to what he had always done, working the land, taking care of his animals, and enjoying the peace and freedom that Margaret had tried so hard to take from him. Every now and then, as he sipped his morning coffee on his porch, he'd glance over at that sign and smirk, knowing that some fights weren't won with fists or lawyers, but with sheer, unwavering resilience. Margaret had thought she could push him out, that she could erase his legacy with enough pressure. But in the end, she had been the one to disappear. And as far as Ethan was concerned, that was the best karma of all.